guys, my name is Natalie and welcome back to Crime Vlogs Weekly. Now, unsolved murders are probably one of the most interesting types of cases that I like to cover, and this is actually the first one that I've covered on this channel. And I think it's just because it baffles me that we go years without actually knowing who the killer is, and in some cases we'll never know. Some killers may even get away with it, and before justice is served they've passed away. This week we're covering the case of American beauty queen JonBenét Ramsey, who was just 6 years old when she was murdered. So when it comes to beauty pageants, I'm sure it's a topic that there's going to be a mixed sort of viewpoint for. Now, I've always thought beauty pageants are quite dangerous, especially for younger children. I think in this case, you know, it's not just them glamming up beyond their years, but also the fact that it's obviously pretty damaging for some children as they grow up. Having done beauty pageants, there's sort of this expectation of what is beautiful, and I think that's quite damaging for young children to be subjected to. With that being said though, there's still a lot of beauty pageants that exist throughout the world, here in the UK, but some of the biggest ones exist over in America. With the case of JonBenét Ramsey, it's still unsolved, so the question remains, who killed her? JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August the 6th, 1990 in Atlanta, Georgia to parents Patricia, who was known as Patsy, and JonBenét Ramsey. From her name, it looks as if the parents created their name by basically taking both of their first names and putting them together. The combination of their first names is something that I don't think I've ever come across before with parents. I mean, I know that some parents take their names and put junior on the end for their children, which, I'm being honest, I can't stand. But I think by putting their first names together is quite a unique thing. So JonBenét had an older brother called Burke, and both JonBenét and Burke had a half-sister, Elizabeth Ramsey, who unfortunately died in a car crash 5 years prior to JonBenét's murder. She was only 22 at the time, and John Ramsey had a son and daughter from a previous marriage. So John Ramsey was a businessman. He was the president of Access Graphics, which is a computer software company. And it was Patsy who was the parent who played the biggest influence on taking JonBenét to these beauty pageants. I think it's very typical that the mum takes the role of sort of stage mum, stage parent, whatever you like to call it, at these beauty pageants. And JonBenét was put into these various beauty pageants in Boulder, Colorado. And JonBenét was very successful in these pageants. She won Little Miss Colorado, and she also won America's Royale Miss. There was also a lot of talk in the press after the murder about Patsy being the typical stage mum, and if you've watched any of the reality TV shows like Dance Moms, for example, then you'll know what this type of behaviour, personality tends to be when it comes to these stagey parents. It's typically those who are quite pushy and sort of living their life through their children. There's not a huge amount leading up to the events of her murder that we can look at, but there is a timeline that we can certainly dive into to sort of get an idea of where everyone was, what was happening in the lead up. So on December 23rd, 1996, a 911 call was made from the Ramsey household. Now, I'm not quite sure what this call was about, but it was later confirmed after the murders, I think on January the 10th, 1997, that this call was made mistakenly by a drunk guest. I assume they were having a party, someone called it by mistake. Do people drunkenly call 911? And I mean, it's definitely worth mentioning it because it just seems so ill-timed, the fact that, you know, the murder took place 3 days later. So on December the 25th, on Christmas Day, 1996, the Ramseys went to a friend's house for Christmas. JonBenét received a bicycle, and there wasn't really anything out of the ordinary or unusual that's been mentioned about that day in particular, and that JonBenét was put to bed later that evening. It is thought though that when they arrived back home and JonBenét was put to bed, that she had actually snuck down to get some pineapple from the kitchen, and apparently there's some information floating around that she had fought with her brother over this pineapple. And it all makes sense because there was undigested pineapple found in his stomach. So on the morning of the 26th of December, Patsy is the first one up. She comes downstairs at 5:30 a.m. in the morning to make herself a coffee, and it's there that she discovers a 2.5-page ransom note.
2.5 pages.
What are they writing? Can we just appreciate a 2.5-page ransom note? That's a really long ransom note. That's a long time to spend writing a ransom note in the house of which you are kidnapping a child. So this ransom note was found on the back stairs leading to the kitchen. And in the ransom note, it said that their daughter, JonBenét, had been kidnapped and that they wanted £118,000 in ransom money. 100,000 of these bills would be in $100 and the rest, the 18,000, would be in $20 bills. Now weirdly, the amount that was specified by the kidnapper or kidnappers was the exact amount of John's Christmas bonus that year. I mean, that's all right for some, isn't it? $118,000. Not too shabby to round off the year. The note also said not to call 911, but Patsy did end up calling the police, which I think in any case is the right thing to do, because I think by not calling the police, you're giving the power to the kidnappers, and that's probably the last thing you want. You want to take back some of that control, so she did call the police. So just before 6 a.m, police officer Rick French arrives at the home and does a search. Now weirdly, he paused at the door of where JonBenét was actually found, which is so odd, but he chose not to go and explore that room, which is just weird. Now already there's a few things that are a little bit sketchy. They seem a little bit odd to me regarding the whole discovery of JonBenét being missing. The ransom note is bizarrely long. Like, have you ever heard of a 2.5-page ransom note? It just seems a bit excessive. It also feels a little bit forced, if I'm being honest. Like whoever had written it from the point of like, we know about John's bonus money, so we're gonna specify that exact amount. It's almost like they were trying to deflect it from being someone else, you know what I mean? Like it seems as if they were just trying to make it seem as if it was someone from the outside of the family and not potentially someone inside the family. I don't know, it just doesn't sit right with me. And then the other thing is that the police officer, Rick French, who apparently searched the property, did not search the entire property. Like, he paused outside of the door of which JonBenét was found. Now, if a 6-year-old goes missing, I think the first thing that anyone would do upon approaching the property is to fully explore the property. Like, she could have been hiding somewhere as like a prank to her parents. I mean, me and my brothers did plenty of pranks on my parents when we were young, so I would have thought that the police officer would have been diligent in his exploration of the house before, you know, going any further with anything else. So early on in the afternoon, the first detective, Linda Arndt, arrived on the scene, and she pulls aside 2 of Patsy and John's friends who had come over to obviously console them. And she said to them, you know, go and inspect the whole house, go and search the house to see if she was here. I'm sorry, don't you have police officers to do that? It's so bizarre to ask them to search the house, but then I'm thinking maybe she did that intentionally. Maybe that was a tactic to get the friends away from the parents so she could have a conversation with them to sort of assess what their behaviour was like, because obviously when a child goes missing and there's no sign of the child, you know, the first line of inquiry usually with anyone who goes missing, anyone who's murdered, it's usually close family and friends. And somehow during the search, John heads towards the door that hadn't been explored, which was the basement, and it was the basement's spare room, and this is where he found JonBenét's body. So this was several hours after she went missing, and initially it appeared as if she'd been strangled. Her neck and her mouth were both covered with duct tape, and obviously this sight evoked sheer terror from John, who ran back upstairs screaming. Later on, before I think forensics had arrived, somehow JonBenét's body got taken from the basement, where obviously all the evidence is, and brought upstairs. Now there's a few articles that say that it was Linda the detective who brought the body up, and others say that it was John who brought the body up. Now I would think that the detective and the police officers would want to leave the body downstairs due to the evidence and possible contamination and, you know, disruption of it. So I'm kind of leaning towards John maybe brought her up. Maybe he brought her up as he was screaming, or he went back down to bring her up. But anyway, her body ended up out of the basement. I mean, doing this research now as an adult compared to when I first sort of learned about the case back as a teenager, the whole situation is just bizarre. It's so odd. Kidnappers don't send ransom notes and then leave the person that they're kidnapping inside the property. Like, they wouldn't do that. They take the person with them. That's kidnapping 101. I also don't get why the police officers and detective didn't do a search of the house, both initially and once the first detective arrived on the scene. I kind of get where maybe Linda was coming from by asking the friends to do a search, but again, the fact that they didn't do a thorough search to begin with is questionable. Also, the family and friends don't have any experience, or probably have very little experience, of forensic evidence and crime scenes, so that if they were to stumble on a crime scene, they could easily contaminate it. Like, I'm no detective or police officer, although I would love to be, but I just find it odd that they took the body from the basement and brought it up. Like, I don't know when forensics arrived, but I think the coroners came that evening to remove the body around 10:15, 10:30 in the evening. So I'm not quite sure what extent forensics were downstairs in the basement, or whether they arrived once the body had been brought up. It's just weird. It's just odd. So the Ramseys willingly gave their hair, blood samples and also handwriting samples to the police in order to cooperate, and that also John's two other children, the son and the daughter, their alibis checked out that they were out of town, so they clearly had nothing to do with the events that had happened. Now, one of the things that I struggle to get my head around, and I think it's one of those scenarios that you wouldn't really know how someone was feeling until you were actually in their position, is that the family moved back to Atlanta a few days after the murder had taken place. Now, I'm not making a sweeping statement with this, but from experience of watching crime documentaries and previous cases that I've done like lots of research on, it tends to be very questionable when someone leaves the place that they were in when like a murder has taken place. Like, they've either like flown out of the country, or they've driven and gone far away from that area. It's very questionable. It's very questionable to the police as well, and it just seems odd to me that that family would want to, even though the daughter is dead, I get it, and it must be an awful feeling to be in the house where it's happened, but I feel like if I was a parent and I'd lost my child, I'd want to still be in that same area so I can sort out things and I can just be with my child even though my child is no longer there. But to go away from the area and move back to Atlanta, it just strikes me as being, they're running away from something, you know? They're running away from something because they maybe feel guilty about something that's happened. But again, I've never been in this situation, so this could be a perfectly reasonable reaction in their minds, just wanting to get away and escape from the place where their daughter had been murdered. So JonBenét's death was ruled as a homicide, and she said that she sustained a broken skull from a blow to the head and that she'd been strangled, and the official cause of death was asphyxiation by strangulation associated with craniocerebral trauma. I'm definitely saying that wrong, I'm so sorry, but yeah, that was the official cause of death. And as I said, the parents were really cooperative to begin with, but it sort of turned on its head and they started becoming a bit more resistant. They would only really answer questions and have interviews on their terms. The district attorney and the police in 1998 said that JonBenét's brother Burke wasn't a suspect in the case, and he was 9 years old at the time. In 2002, the district attorney's successor took over the case, and they led with the theory that an intruder had entered the home to do the killing. In 2003, DNA evidence, which was trace evidence, was found on JonBenét's clothing, and this belonged to an unidentified male. In 2008, the DA cleared the family members' DNA, which ruled them out of being suspects in the case. However, former Boulder Police Chief Mark Brechner said that this was the wrong decision to make in exonerating the parents, especially due to the fact that the DNA sample that was found on JonBenét's clothing was trace DNA, which meant that it was such a small amount of DNA that it would have been hard to determine who it belonged to. And in 2009, Boulder police took back the case and reopened the investigation. So before I get into possible theories, I just want to go over everything that I've already mentioned so far. So the discovery of the body in the house is an interesting one because it makes me believe that there was no intruder. There was also something about it snowing at some point, I think, prior to the murder, and that there was no like footprints found outside, you know, close to any windows or doors where an intruder could have got in. There's nothing in the media about there being any sign of forced entry. So it leads me to believe that, you know, it's not like it's a case of an intruder coming in, getting spooked and, you know, killing them on the spot out of panic and then escaping, because there's just no evidence of that. There's no evidence of anyone breaking in or forcing their way into the property. And then in terms of how JonBenet died, she was strangled and hit with a blunt object. So it's interesting to think how it would have happened. Was she hit with the blunt object first and then strangled, or was she strangled and then hit with a blunt object to kind of make it look as if it had been done out of rage, or, you know, to try and throw off the scent of what it could have been? And the fact that her mouth and her neck were duct taped, it seems a bit like overkill. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, the whole ransom note, the amount of time that this kidnapper would have spent in the property, making probably quite the ruckus, bearing in mind, and the parents, like, no one wakes up, like, doesn't make much sense. I think the police's initial handling doesn't seem right, even if some of it was done tactically to try and get information out of the parents. And I just find it odd that the police just didn't do a proper search to begin with. That first police officer that arrived onto the scene did not go into the place where JonBenet was found. It's just so bizarre to me. And that the family also moving after a few days of the murder. They also moved back to Atlanta just 6 months after the murder took place. And now come the theories. So one of the theories comes from the housekeeper, who would have had access to the property. She had a key, but she openly voiced her opinion on the fact that maybe Patsy was the killer. There's also theories on the local Santa in town and also the electrician, but they don't really sound legitimate. And then there's a theory of a guy called Gary Oliver. He was a 32-year-old known sexual offender, and he'd apparently called one of his friends sometime after the murder had taken place, saying that he'd hurt a little girl, He also fashioned the same knot that was found tied around JonBenet's body, which, I mean, you know, as common as knots are, I think that's just like coincidence. And also, again, he would have had to find a way of getting into the property, forcing his way in, and there was no evidence of that. The theory that I think suspected at the time, and that I still believe now, is that all 3 family members were involved in some way, shape or form. I feel like it could have been Burke that might have killed her. Maybe the argument that they had downstairs over the pineapple resulted in Burke hitting JonBenet with a blunt object. There was this theory that he'd hit her with a flashlight, and that maybe the parents had discovered JonBenet and she was dead, or, you know, she was nearly dead, and that, you know, regardless of whether Burke killed her on accident or not, you know, his parents might have been like, oh my gosh, we've just lost one child, we do not want to lose another to prison time, so we need to help cover this up. And what supports this theory is that, you know, she was found in the home, there was no forced entry, And also the bizarre ransom note that is like 2.5 pages long. It just doesn't make sense. And also the handwriting was eerily similar to Patsy's, and that the handwritten note had been written with a pen that had come from Patsy's office, I think, in the home. So there's a lot that is pointing towards the family members having involvement in the death of JonBenét. But as of yet, no one has actually been charged of JonBenét's murder, and anything that Patsy may have known about what happened that night was taken to the grave. She died of ovarian cancer at the age of 49 in 2006. Hopefully one day the truth will come out and JonBenét will get justice. However, if the family had been involved, do I think that's going to be the case? No. Do let me know what you think about the case in the comments below, and do let me know of any research that I may have missed, anything that's been updated recently that you might have found, any other theories I'd be interested to hear about. Make sure to also let me know what cases you'd like me to cover next on my video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, clicking the bell notification. I'm pointing this way because I always point this way and it's this way on the actual video. So yeah, do like, subscribe and click that bell notification to be notified of the next video that I post. And I will see you guys next week. Bye!